My name is Eleanor Martin. I'm 52 years old, and if someone had told me 10 years ago that the boy who once made me a Mother's Day card out of macaroni and glitter would one day introduce me as my dad's ex-wife at his rehearsal dinner, I think I would have laughed. Not out of disbelief, out of love, the kind that blinds you, the kind that keeps showing up even when you're not sure you're invited anymore. Before I go any further, if you've ever been taken for granted by someone you'd give your last breath for, hit that subscribe button, share this story, and leave a comment. Because I'm here to tell you, sometimes the hardest kind of love is the one that doesn't come with a title. I met Benji when he was just 8. His mother, Tessa, had full custody after a nasty divorce from David, his biological father. David was charming in the way irresponsible men often are. A few surprise visits, a shiny toy, a big laugh, then nothing for months. When I married Mark, Benji's dad, I didn't step in to replace anyone. I stepped in because there was a boy who needed structure, warmth, and someone who didn't vanish after birthday cake. He was missing teeth when I met him, missing trust too. The first time he let me brush his hair, yes, his wild mop of curls. I remember he looked at me in the mirror and asked, "Do you know how to braid?" I laughed. "Not really." "That's okay," he said, his voice small but honest. "Just try not to make it too weird." That night, I watched a dozen YouTube videos until I learned how to French braid, because that's what moms do, right? Or stepmoms, or whatever you want to call the woman who shows up anyway. I was there for every scraped knee, every school science fair, every time the school nurse called because Benji didn't feel good, but really just missed home. I never asked him to call me Mom. I actually told him, "You don't have to. That name's yours to give. I'm just glad to be here." But one morning, when he was 12, he was rushing to grab his backpack and shouted from the hallway, "Mom, can you bring my water bottle?" I froze. He poked his head back in and blinked. "You okay?" I smiled and handed him the bottle. "Yeah, just wasn't expecting that." Mark didn't even notice the shift. But I did. And that word carried more weight than I think Benji even realized. As the years passed, we became a team. I was the one helping him fill out college applications, editing essays at midnight, arguing with financial aid officers. When he got into Stanford, we cried together on the porch. I sold my vintage jewelry collection to help with the first semester. "Eleanor," he whispered that night, "I couldn't have done this without you." "You could have," I said, brushing his hair back, "but I'm glad you didn't have to." Every birthday, every busted tire, every time he left his charger at home and needed it overnighted across states, I was there. Not because I was trying to earn something, but because that's what love without condition looks like. It doesn't ask. It just gives. But I didn't realize then that sometimes the more you give, the more invisible you become. I don't regret raising Benji. I never will. But this story isn't about regret. It's about clarity. About what happens when a woman finally sees things for what they are and decides to stop showing up where she's no longer seen. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The unraveling didn't start with an explosion. It started with a whisper. And a wedding. They say some people show up just in time. But David Hill? He showed up when the cameras were rolling. It was Benji's senior year at Stanford. The kind of milestone you frame on the wall. The acceptance letter, the cap and gown, the proud tears at graduation. I thought we'd made it. That somehow, after all the scraped knees and late-night study sessions, the long drives and quiet heartbreaks, I'd earned my place not just in Benji's life, but in his memory of how he got there. Then David started posting on Facebook again. It started small. A black and white photo of baby Benji on his shoulders, captioned, "My boy, always proud." No mention of Tessa, no mention of me. Then came another, Benji at a middle school baseball game, except David hadn't even been there that day. I knew, because I was. I brought orange slices and sunscreen and stood in the sun for 3 hours, while David, somewhere, was finding himself. At first, I didn't say anything. What could I say? "You know your dad is rebranding himself as Father of the Year, right?" Felt too bitter. So I stayed quiet. But Benji? He started sharing those posts. He started calling David Dad again, without the asterisk, without the hesitation. And around me, he started using my name. Eleanor. Not Mom, not even Elle, just Eleanor. Like I was a guest in his story. One evening, he came home for fall break, all smiles and updates. I was cooking spaghetti in the kitchen, my favorite comfort food, and he walked in, tossing his duffel bag by the door. "Guess what?" he said, pulling out his phone. "Dad might fly out for graduation." I stirred the sauce slowly. "David?" "Yeah." He nodded, oblivious. "He said he's been trying to make up for lost time, wants to be more present." I turned to face him. "Benji, that's sudden. I mean, you barely talked to him last year." He shrugged. "People change, Elle. You've always said that." I almost smiled. He still remembered my words. He just forgot when they were about me. Later that night, Mark and I sat on the porch after Benji had gone to bed. He sipped his tea, silent, but I could tell something was off. "He's slipping," I said quietly. Mark nodded. "I noticed." We didn't argue. We didn't cry. We just sat there listening to the cicadas buzz and the world tilt a little off balance. But things really shifted after New Year's. That's when David sent Benji a vintage Rolex. It arrived in a silver box with a handwritten card. "So proud of the man you're becoming. Love, Dad." Benji showed it to me like a boy showing his mom his first trophy. "Pretty wild, huh?" He grinned. He remembered I liked this model. I mentioned it once, like 3 years ago. I nodded, slowly. "It's beautiful." And it was, but it also cost more than 3 months of his textbooks. I bit my lip. "Did he ask how school's going? If you need help with rent?" Benji blinked. "He's trying, Eleanor. That counts for something." I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake him and say, "Trying is what I've done every damn day for 18 years. But instead, I said nothing. Again. That was the beginning of the great fade. Not a sudden betrayal. Just a slow erasure. My name appeared less and less on his social media. "Raised by a strong village," he once wrote. No names, no tags. Tessa called me once around that time. "I know it's hard," she said gently, "but he's chasing something he never had." I leaned against the counter, pressing the phone to my ear. "What am I supposed to do, Tessa? Compete with a man who only shows up when it's convenient?" "You don't compete," she said. "You just keep being there, even if he forgets why that matters." I didn't answer her, because part of me wasn't sure I could. I was tired of being dependable, of being the scaffolding he never noticed. I kept thinking, how many more years until he remembers who actually built the foundation? But the wedding was coming. And what I didn't know then was that this return, David's grand reappearance, wasn't a reunion. It was a replacement. And I was already being written out of the next chapter. The wedding planning was in full swing. I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd still get to walk him down that aisle. I didn't know yet. The aisle had already been claimed. The thing about erasure is, it doesn't always feel like a slap. Sometimes it sounds like laughter, echoing off the walls of your own living room, where you're sitting on the couch, trying to belong. It was a Sunday afternoon. We were all there. Benji, his fiancée Harper, Mark, and I. Football hummed low on the TV, but no one was really watching. Harper was glowing, bubbling over with excitement, and honestly, I was happy for them. Until I wasn't. "I said yes!" she squealed, wiggling her fingers in the sunlight that streamed through the window. The diamond caught the light like it was proud of itself. "Oh, honey," I said, getting up to hug her. "It's beautiful." Mark clapped Benji on the back. "You did good, son." We were a picture of blended, functional, faux-happy family. For about 5 minutes, Benji sat down beside Harper, still grinning, his leg bouncing with nerves. We were thinking, for the ceremony. He paused, then looked right at me. "I'd love to have both my parents walk me down the aisle." There was a beat of silence, so brief it barely existed, and then I blinked. Harper looked thrilled. Mark gave a supportive nod. I smiled, waiting, just waiting for some form of clarification. Something like, "You too, Eleanor," or even a glance. Instead, Benji turned to Mark. "You think David'll be okay with that?" There it was. A rewiring of history, a rewrite. And I wasn't in it. Mark cleared his throat awkwardly. You mean..." But Benji cut him off. "Yeah, Dad. I mean David." I swear the room dipped in temperature. I looked at Harper. She avoided my eyes, looked down at her ring like it had answers. I looked at Benji, really looked, and something in me splintered. It wasn't the words exactly, it was the ease with which he said them, the comfort of cutting me out so smoothly. He didn't even see me flinch. I got up to refresh my tea, not because I needed it, but because I needed a reason to leave the moment. From the kitchen, I could still hear them talking, about flowers and colors and signature cocktails, about David. "Should we send him a save the date or just call?" Benji asked. "Send both," Harper chirped. "He'll love that. It'll make it more real." More real. What had I been all these years? A rehearsal? Mark stepped into the kitchen behind me, his voice low. "You okay?" I stirred my tea slowly. "Is it bad that I'm not surprised?" He exhaled through his nose. "No, but that doesn't mean it doesn't hurt." I wanted to scream, to throw the tea, to remind Benji that I taught him how to shave, how to file taxes, how to drive in snow. That when he had that terrible flu sophomore year, I spoon-fed him soup and slept on the floor of his dorm room because the bed was too small. But all I did was nod. Let him have his fantasy, I guess. Mark watched me. "You don't have to disappear, Elle." I met his eyes. But maybe I already have. That night, as I folded laundry in silence, I thought about something Benji said when he was 12. We were at a father-son school event. David didn't show. Again. Benji had looked up at me, eyes wide and tired, and whispered, "I wish you were my real mom." And now he had real parents. It was happening slowly, but it was happening. I was being folded out of his story like a corner of paper no longer needed. I tried to tell myself it was just the excitement talking, that maybe he didn't realize how much it stung. But as the weeks passed, I started to see a pattern, one that would only grow clearer with time. I kept waiting for it to stop feeling like a phase, that maybe it was just wedding stress or sentimentality or nostalgia for something Benji never actually had. But time has a funny way of confirming what the gut already knows. It wasn't a phase, it was a transition, and I was quietly being transitioned out. It started small, harmless even. He changed his Instagram handle from @BenjiMartin to @BenjiHillOfficial. When I asked about it, casually, jokingly, trying to sound more presidential, he shrugged. "Just cleaner. Matches the website for the wedding updates." I laughed. "Oh, there's a website now?" "Yeah," he said. "Harper's idea." I found it later that night. Benji and Harper, a new chapter. Photos, venue map, RSVP form, bios, favorite songs. Under parents of the groom, there was a single name, David Hill. No mention of me, not even Mark. At first, I told myself maybe it was a draft. Maybe it would change. But it didn't. The next week, I offered to help with vendors. "I've worked with that florist before," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "She's wonderful with color palettes." Benji nodded politely. "That's okay. Harper's mom has a contact she really likes." A beat. "But," he added, "we could really use help with the deposit on the venue. It's a little higher than expected." I blinked. "Sure," I said slowly. "How much are we talking?" $12,000, he said, like he was asking for a ride to the airport. "Just to lock in the date." "No, if you're able. No, we'd really appreciate it." Just the assumption I would. Because I always had. Later that night, I sat on the edge of my bed with the checkbook in my lap, staring at the zeros. Mark walked in, leaned against the doorframe. "You okay?" I looked up at him. Would it be petty to say no? He walked over, sat beside me. "You're not petty. You're exhausted." I nodded. "I'm starting to feel like a bank account with a casserole dish." He gave a dry chuckle. "That's oddly specific. I just mean, I said, breath catching. I'm the one who shows up with food, with funds, with favors, and the only time I get invited in is when something needs fixing. He looked at me for a long time. You don't have to keep giving. But I did. I gave that check, because I couldn't stand the thought of Benji's big day falling apart. Not for him, for me. Because part of me still believed, if I gave just a little more, he might remember. But instead of gratitude, what came next was silence. He stopped calling for advice, started calling only for confirmations. Did you send the transfer? Did the florist email you directly or Harper? When I gently asked if I could help write a speech or coordinate logistics, he nodded vaguely, then looped in Harper's dad. They planned the rehearsal dinner at a vineyard. I found out through a forwarded email. One day, I caught myself checking the mail with hope, like a child waiting for a birthday card. I wasn't even sure what I was hoping for. An invitation? A thank you? A scrap of acknowledgement? What I got was silence, and the slow shift of being called Eleanor again. Not Mom. Not even Elle, just Eleanor. One night, Tessa called me out of the blue. I got the draft for the ceremony program, she said. There's no mention of you, Elle, not even in the acknowledgements. I swallowed. Thanks for telling me. You okay? I hesitated, then said, I don't think he realizes he's cutting me out. I think he's just rewriting the story he wishes he had. Tessa paused. That doesn't make it hurt less. She was right, and what I didn't know then was that the real wound hadn't even been delivered yet, but I could feel it coming, like a storm just beyond the horizon, silent, dark, and inevitable. And when it came, it didn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors, just a hallway, a closed door, and words not meant for my ears, but that broke something in me all the same. The kind of day where the light doesn't quite know whether it wants to be warm or gray, and the mail is nothing but bills and catalogs you never asked for. I got home early. The office had closed for a last-minute maintenance issue, and I figured I'd use the extra hour to fold laundry, maybe bake something comforting. Blueberry muffins, maybe. I hadn't made those since Benji was in high school. I parked in the driveway, bags in hand, and walked into the quiet hum of the house. Keys jingled in my palm. The hallway smelled faintly of lavender and lemon cleaner. I almost called out, anyone home? But then I heard voices, soft, low, from the kitchen. I paused, not intentionally eavesdropping, just listening the way you do when something in your body tenses before your mind catches up. Tessa and Benji. Their voices carried just enough for me to catch fragments. I stood still, just beyond the doorway, the corner of the hallway wall holding me up like I might fall. She's paid for almost everything, Tessa said. Calm, firm. You can't keep acting like she's invisible. Benji let out a dry chuckle. No one asked her to. She just does it. She's been more of a parent to you than David ever was. Silence. Then Benji again, quieter. That was then. You used to call her Mom, Tessa said, more insistent now. You meant it. That was before I had a real parent again. It was so quiet I could hear the hum of the fridge. The dishwasher beeped behind them, done with its cycle. My heart, however, hadn't finished breaking. I didn't realize I'd backed away from the wall until my shoulder hit the hallway frame. I turned, walked out the front door like I was late for something. I wasn't. I just couldn't stay. I didn't slam the door. I didn't cry. I drove. No music. No GPS. Just the kind of aimless, numb driving you do when you need the road to tell you who you are again. I watched towns blur past. Pecan groves, dollar stores, gas stations with blinking signs that read, hot dogs 2 for $1. I drove until the gas light flickered yellow, and only then did I stop, at a rundown station with dust on the pump screen and gum stuck to the concrete. I sat there for a long time, hands on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the dashboard like the mileage would explain something. That word, real, echoed in my skull like it had claws. Real. As if everything I had done, every ride, every lunchbox note, every bedtime story, every damn appointment I showed up for, had just been pretend, optional. Replaced the second something shinier, flashier, more DNA matching showed up. The worst part? He didn't say it out of anger. He said it like it was the truth. When I got home, the sun had already dipped below the mountains. The house was quiet again, but not peaceful. Still, like it was holding its breath. I didn't go into the kitchen, didn't ask who said what, didn't demand anything. I just changed clothes, brushed my teeth, climbed into bed, and stared at the ceiling. That night, I didn't cry, not because it didn't hurt, but because something colder had taken its place. A kind of finality. A silent door clicking shut inside my chest. The wedding day was coming, and despite everything, I still showed up, pressed, polished, and invisible. But nothing could have prepared me for how thoroughly I'd be erased in the end. The morning of the wedding, I stood in front of the mirror, redoing my lipstick for the third time. I'd chosen a navy dress. Conservative, elegant, understated. The kind of dress that says, "I'm part of this, even if no one acknowledges it." My hands trembled slightly as I adjusted the pearl earrings Benji gave me on his high school graduation day. He doesn't even remember them, I thought, but I do. I arrived at the venue an hour early, not because anyone asked me to, but because I always had. It was at a hilltop winery overlooking the Blue Ridge Mountains. The view was breathtaking, the cold, silent kind of beautiful. I made myself useful, helped straighten chairs, checked the PA system with the sound guy, smoothed out wrinkles on the tablecloths. I didn't wear a name tag. Didn't need to. I was invisible already. Harper brushed past me at one point, looking like something out of a bridal magazine. "Oh, Eleanor, hi! Thanks for everything," she said, not quite meeting my eyes before drifting toward the photographer. Benji walked in 10 minutes before the ceremony. He smelled like designer cologne and nerves. He smiled when he saw Harper, kissed her hand, whispered something that made her laugh and cover her mouth. I stood off to the side and watched. Watched the boy I had raised act like I was the hotel concierge. When the officiant asked, "Who walks this man into marriage today?" Benji turned with a bright, boyish grin and held out his arms. David Hill stepped forward. Tessa let out a breath beside me, like she'd been punched but expected it. Mark, stoic as ever, looked down at his shoes. And me? I just sat still. Benji looped his arm through David's, and the guests clapped as if this moment had taken years to earn. I clapped too. That's what you do when you're a ghost at your own story. During the reception, I stayed seated at a corner table, far from the dance floor. My name was misspelled on the place card. Eleanor. No title, no role. Just a typo. The father-son dance was next. David beamed, his hand on Benji's shoulder, the two of them swaying to some John Mayer song. People filmed it. Harper wiped a tear. Someone whispered, "It's so beautiful they reconnected." I wanted to scream. Reconnected? The man's been in town for 6 months and just learned Benji's middle name. When the toasts began, Harper went first. She thanked her parents, her in-laws, her new family. Then Benji stood. "I want to thank my incredible mom, Tessa, for everything. And of course, my dad, David, for coming back into my life at exactly the right time." He raised his glass. Everyone followed. Not a single glance in my direction, not one syllable of my name. I smiled, I nodded, I toasted, and inside, something was dying quietly. As the cake was cut and sparklers lit the night, I started gathering my things, coat, clutch, silence. I made my way to the back of the venue, near the staff exit, when Benji appeared. He looked radiant, glowing with the ease of someone celebrated all day. "Hey, Eleanor!" he called out, jog-walking toward me like we were co-workers settling the check after lunch. He handed me a folded piece of paper. "Final balance from the planner. Thought you'd want to take care of it before we leave for Costa Rica." I opened it. $3,782.63. No breakdown. No signature. Just numbers on a napkin. Some of the charges I'd already paid for. I looked at him. He smiled, waiting for me to pull out my wallet. And that's when I realized this wasn't about gratitude. It never had been. So I didn't say a word. I stepped past him. Down the stairs. Through the parking lot. Into the night. I didn't cry. Didn't even feel anger. just a kind of cold clarity I hadn't known I was capable of. Somewhere behind me, the music kept playing, and I kept walking. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, not with heartbreak, but with resolve. Because sometimes the moment you're erased is the moment you finally remember who you are. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was angry. That would have been easier, cleaner. No, what I felt was colder, like someone had shut a heavy door deep inside my chest, and I couldn't tell if it had locked behind me or if I was the one who pulled it closed. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, watching headlights slice shadows across the walls like they were trying to write something I couldn't read. At 2:11 a.m., I finally sat up. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I walked into the kitchen and made a pot of coffee. French roast, the one Benji used to beg me to make when he needed help pulling all-nighters in high school. I poured it into my favorite mug, World's Okayest Mom, a joke gift from a younger Benji, and carried it into the home office. The air smelled like printer toner and cedar. The wedding binder sat on the desk, thick and silent, exactly where I'd left it. I opened it, receipt after receipt, itemized invoices, vendor emails, payment confirmations, every flower stem, every chair sash, every damn monogrammed napkin. I'd paid for over 80% of the wedding. And that final balance Benji had handed me like a diner check? It included charges I'd already covered, things he either forgot or assumed I'd just absorb. I stared at the number again, $3,782.63, and felt something shift. Not rage, not heartbreak, just a decision. I opened my laptop and started drafting emails. To the venue coordinator, please verify duplicate charges. See attached invoices. To the caterer, confirm payment received from Eleanor Martin for reception services. To the florist, the DJ, the lighting tech. Then I logged into the joint account I'd set up with Mark, intended for last-minute wedding emergencies, and froze the remaining funds. Mark wasn't going to like it, but I didn't care. Around 4:30 a.m., I sent Benji a message. I will no longer be responsible for any part of your wedding costs. Any remaining balances are between you and your biological father. Please direct further communication through your mother. Wishing you all the best in your new life. I didn't sign it. I just hit send. Then powered off my phone and watched the screen go black like a mirror that no longer had anything to show me. Later that morning, I heard Mark's car pull into the driveway. The back door creaked open. Footsteps, then a pause. "Eleanor?" he called. I didn't answer. He found me in the living room, curled up on the couch with a legal pad in my lap, scribbling out numbers. His voice was soft. "You okay?" I looked up at him. "I think I've finally decided to stop paying for my own erasure." He blinked, then sat down slowly. "That bad, huh?" I handed him the napkin from the night before. "Look familiar?" He read the total, frowned. "Didn't you already pay for the lighting?" I nodded. "Twice, apparently." Mark exhaled. "He probably didn't mean to." "I know," I said. "But he didn't mean not to either. That's the difference." He didn't argue. A silence settled between us. Not cold, but tired. Finally, he said, "What now?" I looked at the pad in my lap. Now? I talked to my accountant, close the joint account, update my will. Mark turned toward me slowly. "You're taking him out?" I met his eyes. "I'm taking myself out. Out of a story where I'm only remembered for the money I spent and the messes I cleaned up." He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. That afternoon, I boxed up the remains of the wedding binder, labeled it closed. Then I reached into my file drawer and pulled out another folder, one I hadn't touched in months. A property deed. A quiet little condo downtown I'd bought in cash as a maybe someday option. Apparently, someday was today. I didn't leave in a fury. I left in the silence I'd been handed, and in that silence, I found something I hadn't felt in years. Permission. By the time the sun rose on Monday, I had already packed 2 suitcases. Not because I was leaving in a rush. There was no drama, no slammed doors, just deliberate motion, the kind that happens when you've spent months pretending not to notice the cracks in the floor beneath your feet. I didn't leave a note. Not at first. Mark had already left for work and the house was still. The kind of stillness that follows a party no one enjoyed. I stood in the doorway of Benji's old room, now a guest room no one used. The bookshelf still held his fantasy novels, dog-eared, spine-worn, forgotten. I ran my fingers along the edge of a photo on the wall. It was the three of us, me, Mark, and a 14-year-old Benji, at his first debate competition. He was beaming, holding a tiny plastic trophy, his tie crooked, one arm around my shoulder. I used to think that photo meant something. Now it just looked like a picture of people who didn't know what was coming. Later that afternoon, Olivia, Mark's sister, called. She was one of the few in the family who still called to ask how I was doing, not just what I could help with. "Did you really freeze the wedding account?" she asked gently. I did. A pause. "He's panicking." "I'm not surprised," Olivia exhaled. "He's not used to hearing no from you." "That's the problem, isn't it?" Silence. She hesitated. "I thought you should know Grace and David applied for a personal loan to cover the rest." "Did they get it?" "No, denied. They're stunned. Apparently they thought you'd step back in." I let out a soft laugh, bitter, not amused. "They still think I'm coming to the rescue." "Are you?" I didn't answer, because she already knew. That night, I finally wrote the letter. Not to Benji, he wasn't ready to hear it, but to Mark. It wasn't cruel, it wasn't angry, it was final. "Mark, I don't blame you. Not entirely. But I can't keep pouring myself into a life where I'm only visible when things need fixing or funding. I've loved this family. Our family. I've given it more than I ever thought I could, but what I've received in return has been conditional, quiet, dependent on how useful I remain. I still care about you, that hasn't changed, but I need to protect what little self-respect I have left. Please don't try to convince me to stay. You'll find the keys on the counter." I folded it neatly, placed it next to the coffee pot, right beneath the world's okayest mom mug. By the time the streetlights blinked on, I was gone. The condo I'd bought months ago, just in case, felt strange at first, like a hotel room without a checkout date. But as I set down the last box and opened the windows to let the air in, I didn't feel regret. I felt relief, weight lifting, noise quieting. I made myself a cup of tea, sat on the couch, and listened to the hum of downtown. Traffic, laughter, a dog barking somewhere. No one needed me. And for the first time in years, that felt like peace. It didn't take long for the silence to shatter. The next morning, my phone buzzed so violently it nearly fell off the counter. Missed calls, texts, even a voicemail from the last person I ever expected to hear from. The morning after I moved into the condo, I was mid-pour, coffee, second cup, no cream, when my phone buzzed so violently it slid off the counter. I picked it up, still warm from the sunlight pouring through the window. 10 missed calls, 5 from Mark, 2 from Olivia, 1 from Harper, 2, shockingly, from Benji, and then 1 voicemail. From David Hill. I stared at the name on the screen like it had grown teeth. David? The man who'd barely shown up to anything. The man who'd spent more time curating his Instagram than parenting. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the play button. Then I tapped it. "Hey, Eleanor. This is David." Like I wouldn't recognize the voice. "Listen, man to woman, I guess, or whatever. I just wanted to say, maybe you're overreacting a bit?" I blinked. Actually blinked, like he'd slapped me with a greeting card. "Benji's having a hard time. You know how it is. Big emotions, big day. He needed me. I stepped up. That doesn't mean you should just walk away from your responsibilities. That's not fair to him." He paused. I could hear music in the background, some indie band, probably at a brunch spot. He wasn't calling from a place of concern. He was calling from convenience. "Anyway, just think about it, yeah? Don't punish him for choosing his real family." His real family. That phrase echoed in my chest like it was scraped across stone. I sat down, phone in hand, heart thudding, not fast, but hard. Deliberate, like it wanted to remind me I was still alive, even after being gutted. This man, who skipped birthdays, missed hospital visits, forgot high school entirely, was now the voice of reason? He stepped up? I stepped up when Benji was 13 and needed an emergency appendectomy, and no one could reach David. I stepped up when Benji's financial aid fell through sophomore year and he didn't tell anyone but me. I stepped up every single day, not for credit, but because I loved him like he was mine. And now, the man who bought him a Rolex and showed up for a photo op thought I was being petty? No. No, sir. That was the moment I stopped wondering if I was overreacting. That was the moment I knew I'd been underreacting for years, so I called my accountant. "Hi, George. I need to dissolve a joint account. Yes, the wedding one." Then I opened my estate documents and began making revisions. Benji was no longer a beneficiary, not out of cruelty, out of clarity. And then, this part took longer, I wrote a check. A sizable donation to a scholarship fund for foster youth. Kids who didn't have parents showing up with blank checks and backup plans. Kids who actually needed what I'd spent years giving to someone who eventually mistook it for entitlement. I enclosed a note, for the ones who grow without being seen and still choose to become good. E.M. Later that night, I found myself standing in front of the full-length mirror in my condo. No makeup, no mask. Just me. And for the first time in a very long time, I liked the woman looking back at me. I didn't feel vindictive. I felt clean. I thought maybe that would be the end of it. A clean break. But grief, especially the grief of being erased, doesn't just vanish. Sometimes it comes knocking. Sometimes it walks back through the front door in tears. It had been 4 days. 4 days of silence. No texts, no calls, no apologies. Just the kind of emptiness that echoes when you've finally stopped carrying everyone else's weight. I still checked my phone. Not because I expected groveling, but because I needed to know if they were going to let me go that easily. They did. Until the 5th day. I was at my desk, flipping through contracts for a new client. Soft jazz played through my Bluetooth speaker, the scent of eucalyptus drifting from the candle on the windowsill. Then my phone buzzed. A single message from Olivia. "She's here. She's crying. Please come home." My thumb hovered. My heart didn't race. It just paused. I stared at the message. I remembered every sleepless night, every whispered, "I've got you," every hospital visit, every homemade birthday cake with slanted candles. And then I stood up. I didn't rehearse what I'd say. I didn't want to. Some moments deserve truth, not performance. I drove back to the old house. Our house, with the steady calm of someone who no longer hopes to be rescued by someone else's remorse. The front door was ajar. Inside, Grace sat on the edge of the couch, hands clasped tight, eyes red. She looked up when I walked in, stood. "Eleanor," she started. I raised a hand, not out of anger, but to steady the room. "Don't rush." She opened her mouth again, but I didn't let her fill the silence just yet. I walked past her, set my briefcase onto the coffee table like I had just come home from work, then turned and looked her straight in the eyes. "Do you remember when you were 13? I asked. "Father-daughter breakfast at school. David hadn't texted in 6 months. You called me crying the night before, said you didn't want to sit alone." Grace swallowed. "I wore that hideous blue scarf you loved," I continued. "Brought your favorite muffins. You held my arm and told everyone I was your mom." Her voice came out barely audible. "You remember that?" "I remember everything, Grace, because I was there for everything." I let that settle before adding, "And I wasn't keeping score, but apparently someone was." She looked down, twisting her hands. "I messed up. I know I did. I was trying to, I don't know, make room for David. I didn't realize—" I tilted my head. "Didn't realize? Or didn't care?" She flinched, like I'd slapped her. "That's not fair." "What's not fair?" I said, voice low but unwavering. "Is that you made me pay for a seat at a table I was never invited to. You walked past me again and again, and I let it slide every time. I sat through every erasure, and I still paid for the napkins." She blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "Custom linen napkins," I said with a hollow laugh. "With your new last name embroidered on them, 447.62. I paid for your erasure, literally." Grace covered her face with her hands. I didn't mean for it to be like this. I got caught up. I thought maybe you wouldn't care. I always cared, I said softly now. That was the problem. Behind her, Olivia stepped out of the hallway, eyes rimmed with red. She didn't speak, just stood there listening. Grace turned toward her. Mom, say something! But Olivia just shook her head. Not this time, Grace. The air shifted. Grace looked between us, panic flickering behind her eyes. I didn't expect you to disappear. I didn't disappear, I said calmly. I just stopped showing up for people who treat me like a utility. She sat down suddenly, hands in her lap, shoulders sagging. So that's it? You're just done? I looked at her, really looked. I don't know, but I do know this. Forgiveness isn't a receipt. You don't get to demand it just because the consequences finally arrived. She didn't argue, didn't plead. She just sat in the stillness, surrounded by the wreckage of a relationship she hadn't realized she'd burned to the ground. I gathered my things, nodded once to Olivia, and walked toward the door. But just as I reached for the knob, Grace's voice came behind me, thin, cracked, desperate. What do I have to do to fix this? I paused, didn't turn around, let the question hang. Then, over my shoulder, you start by not asking me to tell you. And I walked out. I didn't go far, just around the block. I needed air, I needed space. I wasn't sure if I was done forever, but I was sure I was done being taken for granted. I didn't go far, just around the block. The air was cool, dusk pressing in. My heels clicked against the sidewalk like punctuation. Sharp, clean, final. I walked past rows of dogwood trees and porch lights flicking on one by one. Somewhere down the street, a wind chime stirred. It felt like the world was holding its breath. My breath, though, was steady. For the first time in weeks, I didn't cry. Didn't replay the conversation with Grace. Didn't second-guess what I'd said. Instead, I let the silence fill me. Not the cold silence I'd been buried under lately, but a stillness of my own making. I passed the neighborhood bakery, its windows dark for the night. I remembered the time Benji forgot to order cupcakes for Harper's birthday, and I'd come here at 6 a.m., charming the owner into a last-minute custom batch. Vanilla bean, extra frosting. He never said thank you, but I remembered. I remembered everything. That was the thing about showing up for people. Your memories fill with their moments, their needs, their messes, their milestones, and eventually there's no room left for your own. By the time I rounded the corner and saw the house again, its porch light glowing like it might be waiting, I knew I wouldn't walk back in. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. I climbed into my car, hands resting lightly on the wheel, letting the leather cool against my palms. My phone buzzed. A message from Grace. Just one line. I really want to fix this. I didn't answer. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because for once, I wasn't going to rescue her from the consequences of her choices. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reality. For years, I'd been the one to bridge the gap, smooth over the awkward silences, fill in the forgotten details, carry the emotional tab. And for what? To be thanked by omission? No. Not anymore. I drove back to the condo with the windows cracked, letting the wind tangle my hair. I didn't play music. The city soundtrack was enough. Horns in the distance, tires against asphalt, a boy laughing somewhere. When I got home, I hung my keys on the hook by the door, slipped off my shoes, and poured a glass of wine. The red kind, the one I'd been saving. I sat on the couch with the lights dimmed, legs tucked beneath me, and let the quiet sit beside me like an old friend. This was grief, yes, but not just for what I'd lost. It was for what I'd given without question, and what I'd finally stopped offering. My phone stayed silent for the rest of the night. No second messages, no follow-ups, no voicemails. And despite everything, I checked. Not because I needed her to beg, but because I needed to know if she was going to let this go without a fight. She did. For 3 days, nothing. No Olivia, no Mark, no Harper. Just me, the walls of my own choosing, and a strange kind of peace that didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like rest. On the fourth day, I was in my office, deep in a spreadsheet, when my assistant buzzed in. "Eleanor, there's a young woman here. No appointment. She says her name is Grace." I froze. The cursor on my screen blinked like it was holding its breath too. "Is she upset?" I asked quietly. "I'm not sure," my assistant replied. "She just looks tired, maybe scared." I took a slow breath, then said, "Send her in." And I braced myself, not for anger or apology or even recognition, but for whatever came next. Grace walked in not like a daughter coming home, but like someone approaching a stranger with a debt she couldn't ignore anymore. And what she held in her hand wasn't flowers. It was proof. Grace walked in like someone entering a hospital room, not sure what she'd find, but knowing she couldn't stay away any longer. Her hair was tied back, no makeup, no designer bag, just her, and a slim folder hugged to her chest like it might break if she let go. She didn't sit until I gestured toward the chair across from my desk. "I wasn't sure you'd let me in," she said. "I wasn't sure I would," I replied calmly. "But here you are." She laid the folder down and slid it toward me, fingers lingering on the edge. "What's this?" I asked. "I went through everything," she said. "The wedding, every vendor, every charge, every receipt, what you paid, what I owe." My eyebrows lifted slightly. I opened the folder. Inside, spreadsheets, screenshots of transactions, signed quotes, printed emails. At the top of one page was a typed letter, "Wedding Expense Reconciliation Report, prepared by Grace Hill." I scanned it, each line item more precise than the last. $482.60, DJ lighting deposit. $447.60, linen napkins. $3,750, venue installment. Beside each, paid by EM. She had included interest. And at the bottom, a proposed 3-year repayment plan with escalating penalties for missed payments. If she defaulted more than twice, the full balance would be due. "You're serious?" I said. She nodded. "I am." I looked up from the folder and into her eyes. They weren't red anymore, just tired and clear. "I got your message," she said. "The one you sent after the wedding. At first, I hated it. I thought you were being cold, maybe even cruel. But then I started replaying things. Not from my perspective, but yours." She folded her hands in her lap. "I remembered the night before my college essay was due. I called you at 11 p.m., panicking. You were in Chicago on a work trip, and you still sat with me on Zoom till 2 in the morning, then caught a 6 a.m. flight." I didn't respond. I remembered that night better than she did, and that 16th birthday party when David said he'd come, then didn't. You drove to 4 bookstores until you found the last copy of that fantasy series I liked, wrapped it in paper that matched the cake. Her voice shook, but she held it steady. I remembered how I felt that night. Safe, loved, like someone chose me. She swallowed. And I realized I've spent the last year choosing someone who never had to earn it, and unchoosing the person who did. I closed the folder gently. It wasn't about the money. It never had been. But she knew that. That's why she brought the ledger. "I'm not asking you to forgive me today," she said, "but I want to earn that chance. Not with words, with consistency, with showing up." For the first time in a long while, I didn't know what to say, so I didn't. Instead, I opened the drawer on my right, pulled out a pen, and tapped it against the folder. "Okay," I said softly. "Let's see how serious you are." Grace didn't smile with relief. She just exhaled, like someone who'd been holding their breath through a storm. And I saw it then. Not a daughter begging for a reset. A woman, finally taking responsibility. That was 6 months ago. Since then, she's made every payment. Small ones, $150 here, $200 there, but never late. More than that, she's made room. And maybe, just maybe, I'm letting myself step into it again. That was 6 months ago. Since then, Grace has made every payment. Small ones, sure. $150 here, $200 there, but never late, never skipped. I've never had to remind her. not once. And somehow, that mattered more than any apology she could have whispered into a voicemail, because this wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about whether she could show up for something she broke without expecting me to hand her the glue. And maybe, just maybe, she had. She calls me once a week now. Nothing dramatic. No Mom, I miss you theatrics. Just a call. How's your Tuesday going? Need help carrying groceries? Found that chocolate bar you like? Want me to drop some off? She doesn't press for closeness. She builds it. One brick at a time. Last month, she invited me to dinner, just the three of us. Her husband, and me. No photographers, no speeches, just soup and laughter and awkward pauses that no one tried to fix. At one point, her husband excused himself to answer a call. Grace stood, cleared the dishes, and said, "You don't have to stay long, but I'm really glad you came." I looked at her. Really looked. And saw not a girl trying to make amends, but a woman learning how. And that's something I never thought I'd witness. Even Mark and I, well, we're not back together, not in the way people expect, but we're talking again, honestly, carefully. No old rhythms, no pretending, just two people learning how to sit in silence without trying to fix it. It's not romance, but it is Grace. A few weeks ago, Grace came by the condo unannounced, knocked on the door with a nervous energy I hadn't seen since she was a teenager asking to borrow the car. When I opened it, she was holding a small paper bag and a folded envelope. She handed me the bag first. Inside, a candle, eucalyptus and mint. "I remembered you said it helps when your mind's too loud," she said. Then she offered the envelope. I opened it. Inside was a card. Side. Simple. Blank except for the handwriting. I know I'm not owed another beginning, but I hope this one's honest. Grace. She looked up. "There's something else." I waited. "I'm pregnant," she said, voice soft. Unsure. Time stilled. The hallway between us suddenly felt too wide. "I'm due in 5 months," she added. "And I know I have no right to ask, but would you ever consider being part of this baby's life?" She didn't cry. That was the part that got me. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She stood there, prepared to hear no, but hoping it wouldn't be the answer. I didn't say yes. I just smiled. "I've got a lot of good bedtime stories stocked up," I said. And that was enough. Her breath caught, more of a release than a gasp, and this time the tears came. Quiet ones, real ones. We sat on the couch for a while after that. No rush, no plans, just a warmth I thought I'd stopped hoping for. We're not perfect. There are still scars, but scars mean you've healed. They mean you were broken, and still, you stitched yourself back together. And for the first time in a very, very long time, I don't feel invisible. I feel seen, not for what I gave, but for who I was, who I am. And maybe the best revenge isn't silence or distance, but becoming someone they can no longer ignore, not because you screamed, but because you walked away just long enough for them to miss your light. A few months later, I found myself on my back porch, barefoot, coffee in hand, wrapped in a cardigan older than Grace's marriage. The spring breeze rolled in soft over the hills, nudging the wind chimes just enough to remind me that the world still moved gently. Inside, the nursery wasn't finished yet. They wanted me to help pick the paint. "I trust your eye," Grace had said last week, nervously sipping tea like it might steady her breath. It was the first time she'd said trust in me in the same sentence in years. I haven't promised her everything. I can't. But I've given her what's honest. Presence, boundaries, a second chance with no shortcuts. And sometimes I still wonder how we got here. How the girl who once threw her arms around my neck and whispered, "I wish you were my real mom," became the woman who erased me, and then chose to rebuild from the ash. And me? I used to think strength meant staying. Now I know it's knowing when to walk away without slamming the door. Because that's the truth no one likes to admit. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't loud. It's quiet, measured, whole. It's pulling back the love you gave so freely and watching what they do with the absence. I didn't storm out of their lives to punish anyone. I left to remind myself I still mattered. And that's what changed everything. They didn't come running with apologies. They sat in the silence. They felt the echo. Grace didn't beg. She chose to build, brick by brick, call by call, payment by payment. And in return, I didn't offer a reset. I offered reality. And here's what I've learned, and what I'll leave you with. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. You are allowed to outgrow the role they assigned you. You are allowed to stop being the reliable one, the quiet one, the one who fixes everything without being seen. And if walking away feels selfish, remember, self-respect looks selfish to those who benefited from your lack of it. I'm not perfect. I'm still healing. But I don't carry resentment anymore. I carry clarity and quiet, and a future I chose rather than one I was guilted into staying for. So if you're listening to this and wondering when it's your turn, maybe it's when the next apology never comes. Maybe it's when you finally realize no one's going to say thank you. Maybe it's now. Walk out the door, close it gently, and don't look back unless it's to remind yourself how far you've come. I'm Eleanor. I was the woman behind the scenes, the substitute, the afterthought. But now I'm the one they remember. If this story found a place in you, if you've ever poured yourself into someone who forgot you had a name, subscribe, like, share, and tell us in the comments, what did you finally walk away from that brought you back to yourself?